Hey guys, Frosted Knives here, back again with another book review. And today, at long last, we are going to be reviewing by Stephen King. We are going to be talking about Misery. One of Stephen King's best novels. I'm going to put that out right at the beginning of the review. And so here I have it in very well-loved, well-worn paperback. As you can see, it's all dog-eared and ripped, and I don't have it in hardcover. This was a Book of the Month Club main selection. You know what that means? That means a bunch of old biddies read this and discussed it at their book clubs over tea and crumpets. So this book came out in, let me get to my, published in 1988. And clocking in, paperback-wise, clocking in at a modest 338 pages. One of his shorter novels. And if you open the cover, Misery, Stephen King. We open up the cover. Misery's Return, Paul Sheldon. And look, there's a picture of Stephen King as if he was on the cover of a romance novel, a bodice ripper, as they like to call it in the industry. And there's the cover of Misery's Return. I always liked that. I always liked that you know, that they added that in there. I thought that was kind of neat. And it's very appropriate because at its heart, Misery is a romance novel. And we'll get into that. But I'm sure most of you know, but we'll give you the quick and dirty synopsis of Misery. Paul Sheldon is a writer. He writes romance novels. Specifically, he writes the Misery novels. And he is finishing his book. He gets into a car accident, goes off the road, gets really messed up, you know, goes off the road in Sidewinder, Colorado, and he gets picked up by ex-nurse Annie Wilkes, brilliantly portrayed in the movie by Kathy Bates, by psychotic ex-nurse Annie Wilkes, who is his #1 fan. And she brings him back to her house out in the boonies, where she brings him back to life. And everything is going fine until she finds out that he, in the last Misery book, he has killed off her misery. And she proceeds to persuade him, rather forcefully persuade him to write another Misery novel just for her. And now we have the story. Paul Sheldon being held captive by Annie Wilkes, his #1 fan, and how he has to deal with that situation. I will say this is one of the cases where the movie very aptly follows the book, very succinctly captures the book. Annie Wilkes in the book is a bit more psychotic than in the movie. She does more things to him in the book than she did in the movie. I'm not going to spoil a lot of it for you, but I will say that she does more. She is a lot more dangerous. She is a lot more psychotic. She is a lot more off-kilter in the book. And you go a little bit further into her backstory in the book than you did in the movie, because, you know, they had to sort of frame it a little bit better. But still, the movie captures the essence of the book, and it's one of his best film adaptations. So the Misery movie very closely follows the Misery book, and this is a very good book. I read this book. I picked this up and started reading it again for the review, and I was surprised. It's a fast read because you get into it, and it just goes. It goes. It's so fast. It's so gripping. You know, it starts off with Paul Sheldon waking up from his car accident and trying to figure out where he is, and then we get Annie, and then it just goes from there, and it is real pedal to the metal kind of reading. Now, a little bit of a backstory on the book, because I've read some interviews with Stephen King about this. If you kind of want to know sort of behind the scenes, behind the author sort of thing with Stephen King. Stephen King wrote this when he was quitting drugs. He was quitting the dope and he was quitting drugs. This is very much two stories wrapped up in one, really. One was about being an author and being a writer and having people come up to you and saying, I'm your number one fan, and sort of being kind of kooky about it. As Stephen King has a lot of fans, he's a very prolific writer, and he gets his share of crazies, and he gets his share of nut jobs. And so there's always those people that come to you and say, I am your number one fan, and how, as a writer, do you deal with that? And what would happen if you got kidnapped by your number one fan, someone who was really kooky in the head, really cock-a-doodie in the head, if you will. So when you're big and you're a celebrity and you're famous, you deal with this whole, I am your number one fan and I would do anything for you and I would just love to do this for you, and they send you weird gifts and things happen and whatnot. And so, in part, this is sort of his answer to that. But in another part, really, this was the story of him quitting drugs. Annie Wilkes was the drug. Annie Wilkes was the dope. Annie Wilkes was what he was trying to do, trying to get rid of. Annie Wilkes was controlling his life, was controlling his thoughts. He felt that she was controlling his life, controlling his thoughts. Annie Wilkes was a metaphor for Stephen King and his drug addiction. And he tries and he tries and he tries and he tries to, and she just won't go away, and she gets worse and she gets worse, and he can't shake it, and things happen and terrible things happen, and the toll that it takes on your family and on your body and on your mental state and all of this stuff, until finally both Paul Sheldon and Stephen King, they hit rock bottom and they make that push back and they escape, and they finally can break free of Annie Wilkes's paranoid psychotic grip. So on the surface, it is what it is, but below the surface, for those of you who like to get into the heads of writers, it's him quitting the drugs. It's Annie Wilkes is his drug addiction, forcing him to act and behave and think in ways that he doesn't want to, and this is his fight. This is his misery. Misery. The name of the book, is layered because, Misery is the name of the heroine in the Paul Sheldon novels, but it's also Paul Sheldon's misery because he feels that he's chained as a romance writer. He doesn't want to be pegged as a romance writer, but he is being pegged as a romance writer, and he can't seem to get away from that. He can't be taken as a serious writer because he writes romance novels. And so that's his misery. But on the top surface, it's Stephen King's misery because he's trying also to not be pegged as a horror writer. He's trying to break out and write different things, but people keep shoehorning him as a horror writer, and also he has the addictions that he's going through with his personal life, and so that's his personal misery. So it's layered, and it's a really good read. I like that you get a glimpse into it because as you read, you also get to read some of the misery. As Paul Sheldon is writing Misery's Return for Annie Wilkes, there's chapters in the book where you get to read Misery's Return. So we get a little bit to see how Stephen King would be as a romance writer, and he's not much different as a romance writer really than he would be as any other writer. So if you ever kind of wanted to know how Stephen King would be as a romance novelist, then you can read this and you can kind of get into that and see it. The book is well written, it's tight, it's well paced. The characters, obviously, Stephen King seems to do well when his cast of characters is small, like we talked about in Gerald's Game, like we talked about in Dolores Claiborne. When his cast of characters is small, that is when his stories are plotted the tightest. That is when they are the tightest and the best knit together. When he starts getting big, like The Stand big, when you start getting into world building, the characters are still well, but it's the plot that sometimes suffer. Sometimes the plot wanders and meanders. But when he has a small cast of characters, in this case you have Annie Wilkes, and you have Paul Sheldon, and then maybe one or two minor characters sort of helping the plot along, that's when the plot is focused and it's tight and it's well written, and there's no bloat, and everything just sort of goes. And with this book, this is 336 pages. You could easily read this in a sitting, in a day, maybe 2 days, because it just goes, and it goes so well. And I like it because I love the character of Annie, the psychotic nurse that's his #1 fan, but I also like this character of Paul Sheldon, because Paul Sheldon is a writer who has issues. And anytime Stephen King has a main character that is a writer, that gives the reader the opportunity to sort of see beyond the veil, sort of see behind the curtain into how writers write and how they think and how they process. And I like that because we get a little glimpse of how Paul Sheldon writes and how he processes and where he comes up with his ideas and his methods and his processing. And because we're seeing that in Paul Sheldon, we're seeing that in Stephen King, how King writes and thinks and processes and puts things together. So it's a neat sort of little glimpse behind the curtain into the world of the magic, into the world of the great and powerful Oz, of how do writers come up and how do they write, what is their process, and people who are interested in those things, who are interested in how writing writes and how do writers write and how do they think and how do they work. This gives you a little bit of a glimpse into it because, you know, it's Paul Sheldon trying to write for his #1 fan. He's literally writing for his life. And how does he create? How can he create under those conditions? How does the writing process work? And can he do it? Can he? And we find out that yes, he can. And we find out also that Stephen King, yes, Stephen King can. So at the end of the day, I would say this is a must-read for King fans. This is a must-read for horror fans. This is a must-read for psychological thriller fans. Annie Wilkes is terrifying. Annie Wilkes is terrifying because she can be real. And that's why she's terrifying. The situation that Paul Sheldon finds himself in can be real. And that's why it's terrifying. Annie Wilkes could be the person you walk by on the street and you would never know. And that's why Annie is terrifying. Because she can be real. The situation can be real. And you really... He ratchets up the tension in the book so much that you really feel that Paul Sheldon is writing for his life. That he has to do this. He has to do the things that he does in order to survive. Because if he doesn't, he's toast. Just like, as this is a metaphor for Stephen King and his drug addiction, if Stephen King doesn't knuckle down and do the things that he does, it's going to destroy him. If Paul Sheldon doesn't knuckle down and do the things that he does, it's going to destroy them. So both of them, Paul and Stephen King, are writing for their lives, are writing for their sanity, are writing for their escape. And this is just such a great read and a great metaphor for everything. And I would highly, and look at that. I'll leave you with this. Look at how handsome Stephen King looks on the cover of Misery's Return, with Misery grasping seductively on his peck. Yeah. I'll leave you with that image right there. Maybe we'll hold that image up a little more and I'll use that as my thumbnail. There's my thumbnail. Okay, the Misery book. 5 out of 5. No doubt, one of his best, one of my top 5 favorite reads, one of his top 5 best books. No doubt about it. Go pick up a copy of Misery. Go pick up a copy of the movie. It ties in nicely. It follows along nicely. The performance by Kathy Bates is phenomenal. It is great. Captures the spirit and the essence of the book perfectly. 5 out of 5 for me, for Stephen King's Misery. I'm glad I reread it again because it's such a great book and it's such a rich book. So yeah, pick it up. Go read it. You'll love it. Quick read, easy read. There's some gross horror in it, but you'll get over it. It's not too. You won't be too squeamish, especially when you get to the hobbling part. Ding. Okay, so next up on the chopping block, we are gonna start the Castle Rock tour. We're doing the Castle Rock tour. I am halfway through the Dead Zone, which is the first Castle Rock book. And we are going to take our Castle Rock tour. So as always, that is my review of Misery. 2 thumbs up, 12 thumbs up, 5 stars. Go pick up and read it. It's a great book. And as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. And until next time, I will see you in the next video.